Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Explicit Measures Podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Mike.
Hello.
That's not
Tommy.
a bad tagline. Hello, Seth. Hello, Mike.
Happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
It is.
It is.
Jumping in today.
Uh-huh.
So for those of you who are listening, this is a recorded episode, so this won't be live. However, what we do want to kind of talk about here, we're going to kind of bring in something we haven't done recently, is drop in a mailbag. Someone has asked a question. It's a pretty interesting question. So we'd like to address this question. I think this question comes from Stuart. And Seth, you want to give us it's a bit of a longer question. So maybe you want to give us some high-level bullet points on the key points for this question.
Yeah, first, Stuart, thank you for the question. Love the detail, right? Love the nuance. Sometimes we get questions which are just one-liners, which, hey, man, we can take that anywhere.
True. Michael can go anywhere on that one.
In the cases where you specifically want us to talk about a particular topic, Stuart, I think we're dialed in here. It's good. It's good. In an abbreviated form, Stuart says, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what level of detail to include in Power BI reports and data sets. I think the consensus is that Power BI is a tool used for aggregation, so not the place for record-level detail. Vertipack, columnar databases are basically designed for this type of work. However, we get requests all the time from users asking to show details in reports. And he gives a specific use case where he goes through a need to have a reason field behind like a price or modification change to a value that would be produced in the report. He talks about going in and out of other applications or other tools to get detail instead of getting that that level in Power BI if we were going to remove it from there, and talks about the SSRS. Kind of, he says, takes people out of their flow. So he has a concern, like if you're going to use something else outside of Power BI to show detail, is it too disruptive in the end user experience where they're interacting with a Power BI report and then they have to go somewhere else? So ultimately, he asks, do you think it makes sense to just show low-level, high cardinality type detail in the report? What are your alternative solutions for bigger models? And for reference, I think dependent. Large model is a subjective. I think he says small models are less than 3 gigabytes, which he thinks is the case in the real world, which I would agree with. But we can talk about the large model stuff as well, because where do you put details, and do they belong in a Power BI report?
Yeah,
this is a question. Thanks, Stuart.
Great question.
Yeah.
So a couple thoughts thinking off the cuff, just reading through this and thinking through some items here. The first thing that kind of sticks out to me here is just I think I understand some of the modeling challenges that you're facing here, right? The balance of what the users are asking for versus what you're trying to produce in the report is a constant challenge. And you're right. The data models inside Power BI are great at two things: filtering and aggregating. If you have a lot of extra stuff in your model that's causing a lot of bloat, like your DAX measures get really complicated, maybe it's time to go look at the design of your model. Maybe there's something you want to fix there or things like that. My other second kind of observation at thinking about this was, I wouldn't necessarily consider a 3 gig model a large model. I think that's getting up there. It's definitely making you make some decisions around, you're now having to get out of the Power BI Pro license. So there's a decision point for pricing at around that 3 gigabyte level. But I think in general, models are a lot larger. The interesting thing that I think is also in this article is they have about, I'm not sure if it's this data model, but they have around 2,000 users a month. So maybe not super large data, but lots of users. And that also creates a kind of a unique challenge for data sets as well.
So I would love, first off, as you say, it's not a large model. That could be its own internal debate. I would love to see a bell curve of who thinks 3 gigabytes is a large model. And I honestly would think the majority of people would probably say it's on the larger side based on what people are building. Is it large in the scheme of things? Probably not. but I think the majority of people are probably dealing with those types of large models. What's interesting though too is the bloat and a lot of things that he's talking about here is not so much he's talking about some of those like date-time columns, the things that slow down email addresses, even a lot of like if you have a lot of like transaction IDs on a sales table.
Those high cardinality columns.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
we're dealing, I mean, this has been a conversation we've had multiple times, but I don't think we've really dived into it for a topic itself. I mean, we are always talking about what do we give the users? And part what I always think is, well, we don't need to give them the granular detail. But as you were going through this, Seth, I'm thinking about, well, why did they come out with the Power Apps? Why did they come out with Power Automate? Right? Those are non-aggregated, applications to be built in Power BI. So the Power App visual and the Power Automate visual in Power BI, the purpose of those is it's not going to be with aggregated numbers. It's usually with something granular that you can send back to the source.
I'd agree with those things, right? Those are visuals that interact with like row level details of data typically.
Yeah, that's
yes.
the purpose.
Yeah.
So
I think there's 2 points. One is he's in the final say. So on small models, so he's not saying 3 gigabytes is large, right?
Yeah.
Less than 3 gig, which he believes, like we agree, would be the vast majority of models in the world. Do you think it makes sense to just show low level, high cardinality type detail in the report? And I guess I want to answer this in 2 ways, right? One is we're talking about cardinality, and a free notes reason column on every row of data is certainly going to be that column, right?
Sure.
And the challenge with columns like that is they consume the vast majority of space in the tabular model, right? So if it's under 3 gig, I still guarantee you, and the rest of the model is well designed, all your values like align in columnar, can be compressed highly, etc. Like I've seen models and for reasons some I own that 80% of the model is that one column, right? Because it can't be compressed.
Yep.
So I think that's part of it. But the second part here is and I'd be interested in your thoughts too. I don't think I've ever taken a stance that says you can't do detail in a Power BI report.
Never. I never would have.
And
Yeah.
What the reason you typically avoid it is it's going to like it takes a while for that data to render and be returned. So if you can optimize it as much as possible because there's a user requirement, like I'm not saying never do it. Where I more lean into never do it or don't is where people want to dump out massive amounts of row level data and use Power BI like a paginated report. That is where I kind of draw the line. Like it's going to fall apart.
Yep.
Especially when you throw 2,000 users at it, right? Like if everybody's trying to do this like type of reporting, it's not going to go well.
Yes.
And that's just a performance thing. So, those are the things that kind of pop out to me initially from like his request and where we're at as far as like cardinality as well as can I not show details in a report?
You bring up a really interesting point. I want to kind of tag on your last comment there around. I think it really depends on the use cases of the information in the report, and I would agree with you. I would never push someone away from saying, you have too much detail, you need to summarize more. I don't think I would ever really push people away from that and let the model grow to its correct size. But I would really want to ask the question of what happens when users see the information that is there. And I think there's a couple outcomes of what happens when you interact with the data. If I need to go change a single record or update, or it's like a quality of report of data, I'll need links to go to a system that can change the information, right? So there's, if having the detail, excuse me, if having the detail is there so I can clean and correct and look at information, then I think Stuart's question around like, hey, sometimes it's helpful to go to source systems. Yeah, I agree. And you should probably think about, is there a way to deep link, hopefully, into that source system, right? Hey, here's the URL you'd go to, click this URL link, and it takes you to the product or the detail of the thing that you're looking at, and then you can make your changes there. Granted, data will have to be refreshed for that to be updated, but at least the actions of seeing the detail are known. Another thing I think you point out there, Seth, as well, which I think is a great point, is, well, what if you need to data dump a bunch of things, right? What if the details in the model just so people could get a table of data and then hit export? And I'd also agree there. The model might need to have the records in it, but revealing that table of data inside the Power BI report, probably not ideal. There's probably other things, and I think in the question it was noted there's SSRS or paginated reports. I would point to those items as being more relevant to getting tables of data that you need to export. It's easier, it's better on the model, it's more efficient on the back end. Dumping an Excel file from there is much easier. So I think there's, for me, if I was in this situation, I would be like, what do we do with the detail? Why is this there?
There's two very good points there, and I'll speak to the first thing you said, Mike. We did a lot actually with Power Apps and Power BI reports, that integration, both within the report itself using the visual, which really worked incredibly well, and it would actually link to a Power App, and that's where they did a lot of the source change.
Yeah.
But granted, in both those situations, we weren't dealing with a 3 gigabyte model. It was much smaller, but it worked very well. And I think you're speaking to something, not just what do they do when they get there, but I think, to me, I went to how do they get there, to the rows and rows of data. Is it a report where the first thing that they get to is a table of records? Or in a lot of cases that I think usually solves better, is it a drill through where there's already some selective filtering that occurs before they get to the details pages? Usually any page that we've had that has records of details, because it is important, not even whether they're going back to a product page or for trust, just to make sure that what they're seeing, we've had an audit page, but it's always from a drill through page. And that has served usually pretty important. It's served a lot of purposes, and from a trust point of view. But to me, I start with how are they getting to that drill through page? Then there's a lot of reasons and a lot of things they can do from there. But it's the how. Is it because you don't want to? I wouldn't personally just open it up as one of the main pages where someone would get to.
Oh man, two another great points there, Tommy. Yeah, go ahead,
And
Seth.
I think that's a key point that I was going to make later too. Is like how would you do this if you needed to? And I think Stuart outlines the fact that he has this set up. I'd have to reread the parts, but I thought it read such that I have a table of information and it's showing the prices or whatever related to a particular row, and somebody can drill through to the detail, which is the notes of that particular price. Well, that is the best way to get at the detail, because
Yes,
you're using the columnar indexing, right, to already drill down into a very minute area, but you're using those big filter indexes to get to the detail, as opposed to your previous point, which is where I do see a lot of problem in terms of performance, which would be anybody who's opening a front page where all of the table is shown, right?
Yes.
All of that detail
Yes.
is going to take a huge amount of resources to return
Just to run to the
that
table.
information.
Yeah.
And if you're using the Power BI service solely, if you have 2,000 users and a report like this, like that, yeah, you're gonna kill it, man, because it's got to render everything on those tables for everyone every time the page gets opened. So a great way to control that usage of the model is to drill through, because you're only expanding down to the very detail in specific slices with all of that pre-filtered indexing on it.
I think there's another big point too. Mike, you were speaking about this with the exporting data or the general use case. I think if you don't have a call to action on those detailed pages, you're doing yourself an immediate disservice. And I'll kind of speak to this a bit, where usually people will look at those audit tables. If there is no general action that they need to do, there's a product they need to check or someone they need to contact, they're going to find something eventually that's not right. And I think a lot of times they're going to blame the report, they're going to blame the model. But what we've done in a few use cases is we actually took those pages and said, no, go look through it, and if you find something wrong, well, speak to operations or speak to the X, Y, and Z team, because that's where the information's coming from. We didn't know that column X, it should only have 4 allowed values. That's not our role. But if they just go into a page with no call to action, then generally they're going to blame BI and go, we found this error, or what they'll call an error, or this bug, right?
Sorry. Everyone will always blame
the
reporting team first.
Yeah.
Like,
that's
just the nature
of bad data.
Right.
Have you been working in this industry? Like,
yes. I'm just saying preventative things. That's why I'm bringing it up, where there is at least on the page itself, like, see any bugs, contact here, or go to this ticket, basically, and at least allowing them know, like, we know too, it's not perfect.
Well, it's also making sure that you have data stewards, right? So the data, the data engineering, there's definitely multiple teams involved when you get to this level, right? We technically don't own the data coming from the source system. But if the data's coming in bad, the data's going to render bad in the reports. And I've had a number of times where we've had to go through and they're like, well, this number doesn't look right. Yeah, it's not right, because if you look upstream, like, let's trace down the problem. Like, let's go through the measures. Okay, here we are. Data at the source system is actually wrong. So that actually brings up another point. We talk about, what are the use cases of why we need a lot of data? And typically they are, I'm taking data, or the actions are not clearly defined, right? I just need it. Like, so there's 2 worlds I think we play in. I need insights on data, which is talking about aggregations and rolling up data. And then I need access to the data. So insights and access. If I want access, that typically means, let me select a couple options, a filter or 2, and let me dump out the data to a flat table, right? So the access to that data is a different request, because people don't trust it. Maybe there's they want to do their own reporting offline. They're trying to get access to the information and putting it somewhere else so they can, like, leverage and use that information. One of the main challenges I see when you talk about use cases of why we need lots of data or lots of tables of data, one of them has recently come on my radar, is around people just didn't trust the data. There's a trust issue. And so by having more information in the report, they could go down to the detail and they could match what was in the operational system against to the report. So they could actually say, yes, this record transaction is in fact pulling the right data from the source system. It is showing me the information that I need. And so we were keeping too much data in the model just because a team needed a quality check something. So I think it's another use case that you'll find here of why people are asking for all the information, is so they can trust the data, they can get down to the detail, and they can say, yes, this does make sense.
Well, allow me to ask my deep question because you raise up a good point. Is it inherently a good thing, or does it inherently build trust when you show the raws of data, or is it a hindrance when you think about the long term? Because I think that
I don't think it's ever bad to show more data. I don't think you hinder anything by showing more information. I think you have to let people get comfortable. So it's about trust, right? If you tell them you're going to aggregate the information, they have to be able to trust that information at some point.
Let me rephrase that real quick. Is it always a good thing to show all data to all people?
I'm not sure if that's I mean, I think it's an okay question to ask. I'm not sure if it's in the model, I would say you should be able to access it.
Okay.
So I think the answer is you have to determine, again, this is where I would kind of lean on the output of the report, right? What is the desired outputs from this report? The actions derive the level of granularity that you need. So if your action is, I need to see, again, I was listing things down where I've seen lots of data records or a lot of detail being shown. One was, hey, I have a lot of data from many, many customers, and I need a model that rolls up all customers' data into like a bigger model. That could get really large. Another version of this is financial, right? I have an invoice and have invoice details with the header and header details of invoices. I need to see all that information in a model. That can get really expensive because every single line item becomes a record or row of data. And if you have lots of invoices or small amounts in your organization, you could be making millions of rows of data in a month. So in those cases, I would look at this going, when I have those needs, the question usually comes down to, okay, what is the need? What is the real output of the information? Are we talking about real summarization of things, or are we actually saying we're trying to quality check or look at the details of stuff? So again, I think the answer is like it depends.
Okay.
I don't know. Go ahead, Seth.
When you say trust issues, like and you're pulling additional data in, is that just like you're speaking it's in a model and then you display that for data validation in a different report, or are you burying that in the report?
So I've seen where I've been recently looking at this scenario was we have aggregated numbers. People look at those numbers and they want to go down to the level of detail, saying, hey, I'm looking at this product on this date for this team. Like you're going all the way into the weeds because someone is trying to check the numbers. And again, I wouldn't put it on the main page like you said, Seth. I think there's a whole methodology of, how do you make the report efficiently run? But there are teams that are, when you're looking at the data, when you have another team reviewing the model, as they get into that model more, they're trying to get to that data level, that detail level, because they have to match it to something that they can actually see.
Yeah, I guess my question is when would it be a good idea to not have to do that in your model though? Like like do you pre-aggregate numbers in the source system and those are the numbers then that you
check against?
That you build upon in Power BI, right? Because like 100% in a lot of the use cases, there's we're building DAX calculations. We're aggregating data off of raw data.
Yes.
But one of the challenges within there is, to your point, I want to validate the aggregated number that you're producing.
Yeah.
So I have to provide the detail.
Sure.
Versus removing that out of the model. And this is probably dependent on model size or volumes of data that you would push that back more into the source and have a different layer of, okay, the pre-aggregate, all I have to show you is that my additional calculations on top of the pre-aggregated numbers tie out, as opposed to pulling forward all of the details forward into the model to have to prove out. And I'm not saying it's not a worthwhile exercise, because absolutely it is, especially in finance. Like you have to tie things out.
Yes.
And you can only do that so much with documentation without a validation check somewhere in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like this is the calculation we're doing. Here's how it rolls out, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just interested in like, where's the break line of, do you always do that in the front end in the detail in the report model? Or is it a volume issue at some point that you're going to say, hey, we need to pre-aggregate some of this, and that's where I'm going to point you for a lot of your data validation checks.
And let me give you a very common scenario that occurs too when you go into those rows of details, when you don't have the data stewards. If they find a row that one of the columns is wrong, like let's say the sales rep or the country or the account number, well, the immediate thought, without anything usually set up like a maturity from a governance point of view, is, well, if this is wrong, how can I trust anything else is wrong too? Or how do I know something?
You start eroding trust right away.
So the immediate action from there, without a good setup system, is, well, I can't trust this report now because I'm responsible for the numbers in here, or my performance is tied to this, and now it's showing the wrong thing. So, and I have thousands of rows in here, so I don't want to be judged on this. So therefore, that there's a pretty big windfall from that, and that honestly leans towards the other way.
Well, let's go back to Seth's question there. So I don't want to go too far off the route, off a path here, but your question was, what's the right break point of quality checking? Where does that live? And I think it depends, Seth. I think that's a great question. I think that's if I think about that question, that is a place where organizations need to identify what kind of data this is. Is this something that we're going to certify? Is this something that's going to be from the central BI team, or is this something that a team or department level is doing? Who needs to own this looking forward? And to some degree, right, if you have team members that are able to build, again, if we think about the data comes from a source system, it's usually not in the right form. So there's a whole bunch of engineering, or a black box of engineering. We're shaping data, we're making fact schema or star schema type stuff, right? You're trying to simplify the model a little bit so that it becomes easy to consume as a report consumer. If you have enough time or capability in your team, you can do data quality checking upstream inside that data transformation stage, right? And so I think when I look at this going, okay, if I think about a certified data set, typically my M queries or Power Query in desktop are very simple. Select this table. Here's my incremental refresh policy, and that's it. I mean, so if I'm doing the data engineering outside of Power BI and that's happening upstream somewhere, then the quality checks could start upstream as well. And you can do some quality checks there initially to get people's confidence. And maybe you even produce a separate data model with a certain amount of information that is detail related so that people can trust it to gain that trust. And then you in the final report, do the aggregation. But now you have something to compare against. So I have like a detail view with some aggregations that I can apply to my final view, which my final data model that has existing aggregations in it, so that you can say, yeah, these numbers match, we're good to go. However, I think the story changes when you start having a lot more data engineering inside Power Query, inside the models, because now there's a lot more chance for risk of introducing errors into that data engineering that should not be there. And then in that case, you probably have to keep the detail because you have to vet those Power Query or those transformations in M are actually doing what they should be doing.
Because your ETL is in
the model,
that ecosystem.
And that should not, I think the transformation shouldn't be available to all. Everyone should see that. I think that's more from the engineers. If you're doing a lot of the transformations in Power BI or data flows, right?
Sure.
Those transformations and what you're trying to choose should be more the data stewards, because now the BI team is responsible for that. So let me back up a bit.
No.
No.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So there's a really good situation that we had where we introduced a sales report and it was available to the sales team. And immediately there was this backlash where this country's wrong, this account's wrong, and no one could trust the report. Which the immediate findings was this was actually the source systems that this was coming from. It was just now revealed how many errors this were. This led to a data contract or a contract in this report from the vice president saying, if you see something, say something or change it, because this is what's actually you're getting. We're going to be using this report. We can't help if you've inputted the information wrong. So this report's now, it became almost an audit report for the entire sales department.
This is my speaking to the point of quality checking, right? This is the quality check.
But this had to be, in a sense, call it a contract, call it an agreement.
Sure.
But there was an actual handshake, so to speak, between this BI and sales, where we're going to show you the information, but you are responsible for changing it. If you do not change this, you will still be reported based on what it says. But
I think this brings up an important point that I don't think we've called out very often, but if you want to protect yourself as the report author, as a BI team, as whatever, we have typically we traverse many different areas within the organization. And I think it's very important that unless given the time and or understanding the processes and standards within the organization, if you don't have time or you are not being asked to test, analyze, validate data, like in those source systems and understand it, but you're just building a report on it, then it's your job to ensure that the report consumers understand that this is not validated.
Yeah.
It's not certified. It's not anything until you put it through that rigor.
Yes.
And it's only like, this is where you go into like, oh, well, people don't trust it. And that just means you're plugging into a source system and throwing a report at people without communicating that.
Yes.
Right. Because it shouldn't be like, listen, especially if you're not doing like a bunch of transformations in things, because it could easily flip, right? Where you start doing a bunch of transformations in Power Query and all of a sudden you are screwing up the data.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there could be absolutely that. But validation and analyzing the actual data that's coming in and going into a report and communicating who the owners of those things are, I think absolutely should be part of conversations before you just throw something out the door.
And we noticed with that data contract that we had, within a month, the majority of the issues, the report morphed back into a report rather than this audit report, because people were all of a sudden had the fire lit up. Now, the reason why I want to go back to the point where I thought to say, backtracking about if you're doing a lot of ETL and Power Query, the reason why you wouldn't necessarily show all those records there, because to the user, they're not going to make a lot of sense. The reason why someone wants to see the
I
detailed
disagree.
hold on. So the reason why they want to see the detailed level data is because they can always usually relate it back to a source system. They can relate it back to CRM. They can relate it back to Salesforce. They can relate it back to something in marketing.
Okay.
That column to that value. Now, when I am doing an incredible amount of ETL and Power Query, or an incredible amount of manipulation, like first-time customers, second-time customers, it's going to be very hard for them to validate that against anything. The normal consumer. Let me reiterate that. If I'm looking at detailed level information, I want to compare that against a source system. If the transformations are all coming from Power Query, there's no way for that user to validate that.
Disagree. If you're abstracting the data so far away from what's in the source system that no one can understand what the information is, someone needs to document that, and there needs to be a quality process around that to verify what you're doing.
Fine,
So
but that's not all data to all people, though. That's
it's
for
still part of the model.
Yeah, no, I agree, but
what do you mean all data, all people?
I don't even understand your statement there. Like all data, all people. If you build a model and give it to people in a report, anyone who's able to see the report has like. I don't even understand the question. I'm losing context here.
Yeah. Okay. So the question I asked earlier about should you show, if you have a model, should you have an audit tab that's available to everybody? You said yes.
I don't think we ever asked that question directly. So I'm saying one of the use cases of where reports. I think you're misreading my interpretation of my statement earlier. I think my question is, when I find people asking for lots of details of data, what they're trying to do in that experience is to audit the data.
Okay.
Does every report need an audit page? Maybe. Does that page need to be exposed to every external user? They may not understand that. Maybe not maybe it's hidden somewhere. Or maybe there's a separate report hanging off of the data model that's doing more of that quality checking, because that is part of your certified process to be able to make that report page or to make that report certified. I think in both cases here, we're still talking about we're talking about trust in the report. We're talking about getting people to verify that the information that is in the report is accurate in what they say, so they can make decisions off of it.
Sure. Let's go back to the question then. If you're doing an incredible amount of transformations in Power Query, what does the average consumer, not the stewards or not the validation side, but the average consumer need to see from the details that they can make sense of?
So
make sense of where?
If we're going to have a details page.
Okay. One, you're never going to have a details page in a report that describes in detail all of the transformation, everything you're doing.
No.
An audit page in Power BI would, in my view, would be to audit the calculations and things that you're doing within the model. If somebody needs to understand the difference between source data that they're going to dump out from a source system and the data that gets aggregated or put in the report, that is where documenting the business logic in business terms, not in what I'm doing in Power Query, is important for them to understand. Because if they can't, they can't make the leap from source system to what I'm showing them in a report without understanding that I'm applying all of these business logic conditions and transformations to get it to a shape where I'm building calculations on top of.
Right. And I meant to use the word audit, not necessarily details where I'm explaining the transformations, but.
So things where I feel data communication needs to be very clear, where business logic, I feel like, has been applied, that makes this challenging. Whenever you're trying to join two tables of data together, those joins or how those joins are being handled is a potential weakness, right? Yeah. Did your join actually make sense based on what the business understands the relationships of those datas?
I see a lot of trip ups there.
The other one, another element that I see where potentially is challenging is whenever you have an allocation of data, right? We have like, hey, there's a dollar amount and we need to reallocate that money, right? The source system tracks it one way, but the business looks at it another way. So you take this large amount of dollars and you have to distribute it across either multiple people or multiple categories or whatever. Things like that, right? When you have things that are being like reallocations, when I hear words of, oh yeah, we're just going to allocate, my head just goes nuts, because what is happening is the source system isn't capturing the data the right way, the way the business wants to look at it. And someone in a process has said, no, we're going to redistribute this data so it makes sense financially or That's how we look at our business, whatever that is. Whenever people start saying the word allocations, I get real nervous because I'm like, that's a very usually heavy weighted business logic piece that, to your point, Tommy, that obfuscates what the users see from within the report to what they see in the source system. And there's less transferable knowledge between the two systems. So I would agree with you in that way, right? When we're talking about joining things together, when we're talking about allocations on data, those are areas that I feel cause more challenges for organizations. However, what I would say though is when we're trying to check against source system, if we're doing so many transformations that I can't get back to a record that's in source, then I would argue we need a better process around what the report is doing, because we're now at a place where you really can't quality check the report. And that would be a team of people. There's a quality assurance team. You're doing some QA work on a report and showing people, okay, how do we get to this number? Let's spot check some things. And then as you make changes to the model, you have a regular way. I'm going to use a term here that I think is kind of becoming a bit more popular. You have a little bit of a data ops process. How do we operationalize the data? How do we regularly show you the data is changing, but it's changing in a consistent way every single time?
But this is where I think, and that's a really good point, because this is where I think you start extending outside of the report, where we talked about how you start to elevate a data set into a different realm, where you have proven out that within Power BI, you've connected these systems, you've gotten to the point where there's a lot of transformation happening, and it doesn't belong there anymore. We need to make sure that it's in core systems, that this is how things operate. This is how danger, Wilbur, and allocations work, right? That are not buried in a report, right?
Correct.
Because they shouldn't be.
Yes.
So I think that, to me, all of a sudden raises that flag of like, okay, now we need to start talking to a team to push this into a much more formal process where we build even more rigor around checks and validation to ensure that the data coming through is as accurate as possible.
What I have found, though, is when you have the trust built with the BI team, teams are more willing to take more raw data and let BI do a lot of those transformations. But Mike,
I would totally agree with you.
Yeah. And that's usually where those more call it convoluted models come from, where it's not so much the two raw data sets of tables, where it's like, well, we have this API that we'd love to see, and also this and da. But you raise a very good topic that I think is a good question when we talk about the audit tables. Do you put your DAX in the audit tables, or any type of DAX in those audit tables? Or do you remove all the summarization? So, because, and I'll say for myself, I never put any of the actual DAX calculation. If you want a raw audit table, that's what you get. You get the values that are nothing's summarized, usually.
I'm going to go. My answer to this question is going to probably be not a good one.
Okay.
But I'll give you one anyways. When the DAX calculations get very complex,
in those allocation scenarios,
you need to, like when you're doing complex filtering and you're doing, other things inside DAX. Again, where I've seen this happen, again, this is a general rule of thumb. This is not in every use case. When the DAX gets more complicated, it's because the tables and the shape of the data that you have in the table elements are not as easy to use. You're trying to do some extra business logic inside those DAX statements. And I've seen some very complex DAX things. I typically prefer my DAX to become simpler, right? I'd rather have the DAX become simple, and I'd rather do more engineering on the data to shape the data for what I need inside the report. So that being said, right, when you're talking about a quality page, your measures are hopefully doing simple things, and there may be a handful of pages or a page or two that is doing some checks around what the measure calculations are doing, because you should be able to go to a column, drop in a couple categorical values, and see the details rolled up and know that that's the same value as the measure. So you may do some things there, but again, I've had very good success. If the measures become simpler, they're much easier to check. So they're not really required as much to go into the quality pages. And again, if these quality pages are meant to go back and help you determine what's in the source system and match those numbers, thinking like invoice detail or something along those lines, right? Here's the invoice. I can literally see the invoice in the source system, and I need to verify the total dollar amount on this record or for this customer is the same amount. then yes, you go. There is no measures there. It's just simple.
Right.
Show the values.
You're also speaking like rainbows and unicorns and, all those dreams that never occur in most business logic or models. But no, I agree. I agree with you saying where an alternative we've done is not so much an audit table, but where it's more advanced DAX and people are trying to check that. It's basically summarized tables of categories, countries, or months of that DAX calculation, just so they can say, hey, Karen had this, Joe had this for this number, of a quick and easy summarized view where they can kind of check the high level values. But it's almost impossible to put the DAX in those audit tables because it doesn't work that way, especially with a little more advanced scenarios. Or
I disagree. You got to check the DAX just like you do all the raw data. It's part of the data model. It will calculate things. And again, as you do more complex filtering, as you try to blank out values that should be blanked when they don't have the right filter context or not, the filter context matters in the measures. So a lot of times I've seen measures being created without any level of protection around this measure only works in this very specific scenario. Therefore, you have to add other conditions to that filter. That way you don't put a measure on a table or a measure in a place where it doesn't belong.
Your hidden filter on a card. Just so, yes. I know what you, yeah.
Right. So we've successfully once again diverted into trust and audit from details. So bringing it back to the conversation, if around details and specifically this concept of going from a report elsewhere, when do you guys kick people in, if possible, right? Because it's sometimes you can't push them into a different application, but like when possible, when do you choose to kick people into a different application as opposed to using the details within a report? Like what's your threshold, or like what's your use case?
I don't think it's the number. I think it goes back to Mike's point at the very beginning of this, the why of what is someone trying to do in a details page. And I think the number or the threshold is not a gigabyte or a megabyte issue. Usually that could be 100 rows, but if the reason why they want to see that is they do want to act on it, then give them that access.
I think I would also echo the same thing. I think you're saying the same thing I would, Tommy, just a little slightly different way. I think it boils down to the actions I need to take on that data, right? If I say I need this table of data with these number of columns and I'm going to export it and I'm going to go do something else with it, then I would maybe push you to a different tool, or I would push you somewhere else to go. If I need to see this row of data and I need to go change a record on it. Well, yeah, the action is change record of a data.
Sure.
That's going to happen somewhere else. Like I'm going to kind of launch someone else to another application, and maybe I'm doing something fancy where I'm, maybe I'm embedding a Power App inside Power BI. Fine, right? I can click a row of data, I can get a record in Power Apps, and then I can change the record right there immediately. Great, super cool. But when I am expecting people to use the insights and information from that data that's in the report, I'm less inclined to route them to another part of the application.
And I would agree with that, right? Because like even as Stuart's question aligns, and what it seems is that I think is being glossed over here is the end users are already getting value because you've created an aggregation or some sort of insight that is driving them into looking at something more specific, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of the action, I think the default with me too would be, kick them into a system where they can do something, right? Because we've shown them like, hey, here's your percentage of failure. Great. Now I know my 3% errors. What are those errors? Okay. Mm-hmm. Why did this happen? Like drill through, like, or I need to go fix something because something's broken. Link to the application to go fix it.
Yes.
The only other use case that I could think of where I would probably kick people into a different application that wouldn't necessarily be like I want to take an action is where the volume of data is so large, or there's different types.
Great point.
There's attachments, or like there's going to be Word doc or descriptions, like where I'm not going to just consume everything out of and this is might be a poor example, like a Salesforce opportunity and all the fields within that opportunity.
Yep. The full history of that opportunity or whatever.
I may just kick them into Salesforce to look at the opportunity and everything around that, because that's going to give them their full picture, especially if there's columns like not reason code hopefully has a character limit, But if it's like paragraphs of information,
Yeah.
like, I'm not pulling that in, right?
Power
So
is
that
not
would
great at
be-
representing full paragraph like that.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where you get into trouble, like with the model really exploding. But those would be the two use cases where it's
That's-
like
I like that.
there's so much ancillary data that I would never suggest pulling all that in, because you're gonna have storage, let alone access
Right.
problems, even on a drill through. But just it like to have it in the model doesn't make sense. So
Well,
as long as that detailed level data is limited, and then maybe there's a link through that if there's other additional information into an application, but like you can get a long way with solving those problems with, if rather than a reason code, if it's just a link to, like, a fabricated link to an internal system. And if people aren't familiar, like, typically you can there's a common URL string you can construct that with one identifier that would be in a data set or two, right?
Yes.
That get
Especially in the
interjected into
2023.
the URL, right?
Yeah.
That get interjected into the URL, and it just becomes the link in a report where people can easily navigate between the two systems. And ultimately, like, I think where I land is, if somebody is going from insight to analysis and action, like, the report has served its purpose.
Right.
They're doing multiple different types of activities from a report consumer perspective, right? You've highlighted a particular area on an aggregate level in the Power BI report, or at least the hypothesis is here that is happening first before somebody's diving into detail. Because if they're straight diving into detail, then we just go back to SSRS. Why aren't you just dumping all the detail out for them in some way?
Yes.
Right?
And-
because that's all they care about. And in some cases, then fine.
And this makes a lot of sense too, where I don't know why Power Apps default view, if you connect to Power BI, is the phone view, where you can do a lot of those characters or those records in a system that makes more sense to showcasing that. Where if I have a table and I have an app the size of half the screen, Power Apps, where I can show those paragraphs, I can show that detail, and if I can act on it if I need to, because generally speaking, I'm only going to want to see those paragraphs or those fields or those media items per record, not for multiple records.
Right.
And that's where, like, Power Apps makes a lot of sense, even embedded on the screen. But yeah, we're in the year 2023. Your system by now, except if you're CRM, or dynamic, sometimes has a direct link that makes a lot of sense. But, and again, that's only the last thing I'll say to that is that's half the people that need to do that either have access to those source systems. The other half goes to Mike's point too, where they're going to want to explore and do an analysis. I'm surprised, Mike, one thing we haven't talked about with the analysis roles, like I want to act on this from a more granular point of view. I want to do more detail in Excel, not talking about the analyze in Excel as one of the features either, which we can save for another day.
Yeah, I think that's another. Again, I think it's all action based, right?
Right.
If I want wide tables of data, I'm not probably going to push you to Power BI. If you want exports, again, I think it really boils down to access on data or insights of data, right?
Yeah.
If I want the report to tell me something to do, that's an insightful thing. If I just need access to the information, yes, the model is key, but then I'm accessing it potentially through a pagina report and to export my data. Maybe I'm going directly to Excel to get the data. Maybe I have some detailed pages inside the report. And also, to answer the final questions here from Stuart, there was kind of two main questions at the end. Do you think it makes sense to show low-level cardinality data types, details in the report? And the second question was, do you have any or alternative solutions to larger models? And so for the first question, to kind of very directly answer that is, yes, I do think it's irrelevant to have that information, but only when it's action-based, when the output of that information is going to be used and what actions are going to be taken by seeing that lower level of data. And then you can really evaluate what is the right level of data. And again, I would argue, aggregate as high as you can, because it just makes your model smaller. It makes it easier to work with, but you need to have back-end engineering for that. And then the other thought here was around what are alternative solutions for bigger models. Well, then you start using mixed models and start doing, direct query on a larger table. So direct query works good when you have a small number of records you're interested in, but you can have imported tables that have a much higher granularity. So when models start getting really large, you don't bring all the data to Power BI. You only import a portion of it that is aggregated so it runs nice and fast. But then on the details, you push people to pages or you design things in the report that are doing import level things. And you have this real time looking at the information that is actually occurring inside the data set. So there's definitely other techniques you could probably use for larger solutions when you have bigger data models that could further tune those down. Do you guys have any other thoughts for those kind of two questions?
I agree with both those points. You may not have action because it almost sounds like in the reason code, people are just doing a final check or validation why something changed.
Yeah,
which is why you'd want that detail, and which would be the only addition to point one. And point two, I really like that idea. Like the larger you go, the bigger the problems become, right? And
I'd agree.
It's typically going to be performance, so that it might require a restructure, right? And you might get those data points returned faster by doing something like a direct query to access that, so you don't have the model size problems. So it's a really good point.
All right, with that, I think we've burned through a perfectly good hour of your time. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much for listening to this conversation. Stuart, thanks for the great question. We talked a lot of things here. Hopefully some of those helped you out, if not confused you more throughout this whole pattern here. So thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it. Our only ask, if you found some value from this conversation, if you found some other points that you didn't think about earlier around large data sets, high cardinality columns, what you can do with those, we'd love it. Share the report with somebody else that you think might find this also valuable. Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find it anywhere it's available, Apple and Spotify. Make sure to subscribe, leave a message. If you want your question or topic to be discussed on the podcast, go to powerbi.tips/the mailbag. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central.
Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.